The German army during the Second World War is remembered as having some of the most advanced and efficient tanks, trucks, and other mechanized vehicles. There are plenty of historical videos and images which reflect this notion, but you may be surprised to learn that when it came to transport for the army, vehicles played a very small part. Horses were the real backbone of the German army's movements, and if you stick around, you'll see the sheer numbers used during the war. In today's video, we see that Germany had more horses than you think. If you enjoy this video and want to see more, hit that subscribe button. It's free and really helps the channel reach more history lovers like you. Germany's portrayal of being an unstoppable fast-paced army is no accident. The Reichsminister for Propaganda Joseph Goebbels worked incredibly hard to paint this picture. Pushing into Poland in 1939 and again into the Low Countries and France in 1940, travelling at great speeds with their panzer armies was indeed a great feat. These tanks and the mobile infantry moved swiftly through the countryside. But it was the supply lines and transport of reserve troops and equipment where the real German army showed its colours. Horses had always played a huge part in major conflicts prior to the Second World War. The Great War, only a few decades earlier, saw millions of horses. Even dating back over the centuries, these animals were an integral part of armies' movements across the globe. The problem for Germany is Britain and the United States had moved on from this by the time it came to fighting them. Britain especially had begun experimenting with vehicles in its army towards the end of the 1920s. The German reliance on horses is actually quite interesting. An estimated 80% of transport and logistics was horse-drawn, while motorized making up the other 20%. At the start, around 500,000 horses were available. At any one time during the war, a little over 1 million would be used across all fronts, with the final estimated number of horses used by Germany totaling 2.75 million. These animals would be used to pull carts filled with supplies ranging from shells, ammunition and weapons, to food, fuel and water. They were also useful for pulling heavy artillery and anti-tank weapons along the battlefield. On the Eastern Front, they were particularly useful in muddy terrain, able to push through without getting bogged down like many of the vehicles. But as reliable as they were for the most part, taking that many horses into a war zone brought with it a lot of issues. Feeding these animals, for one thing, was very difficult. The horses couldn't just eat grass all day, especially in the winter months where it was harder to come by. They needed grain and lots of it. This meant that along with food and supplies for the soldiers, food for the horses had to be brought along too. They also required people to wrangle them and look after their needs such as grooming and shoeing. They needed shelter in the winter and disease was easily spread between the animals. Because the German army was on the move so much, they were also often overworked and therefore susceptible to an early death from exhaustion, starvation or disease. These long, slow-moving horse columns of German supply lines were also easily picked off by Allied aircraft or artillery. For the East, it was incredibly difficult to bring up replacement horses, as they themselves needed to travel the thousands of miles from Germany or surrounding countries into the Soviet Union to substitute for the ones on the front lines. This meant by the time they reached the men on the front, they were often already tired and in no shape to continue the advance. The Soviets also used millions of horses themselves, although they made use of many trucks, tanks and other vehicles. But it was mostly on the Western Front where German soldiers who were captured saw an almost endless line of Allied motorized vehicles heading towards Germany. The surprise for them was the ability for the Allied army to move so many men, machines and supplies, with little to no reliance on horses. A definitive difference for that would be Germany's supply issues with fuel. They were forever attempting to capture as much fuel as possible for their tanks and trucks, where the Allies had more than enough to go around once their beachheads opened up. I suppose it's a little sad that history doesn't remember the millions of German horses who took part in the war. They essentially allowed Germany to gain as much land as they did across Europe, the Mediterranean and North Africa. Without their assistance, the logistics and supplies for these frontline troops would have dried up. Perhaps the war would have been a whole lot shorter had the humble horse not been the main part of Germany's fight during World War II. Did you realise that Germany relied that much on horses during the war? Or maybe you just assumed they were mostly a mechanised army? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section down below. As always guys, thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you want to expand your knowledge and join the growing Premier History community.